I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today, we're going to go through the EIA, really kind of dig into the numbers, look at the supply-demand aspect, and then go global and look at things in terms of, what is the TSA data saying? And we have some new data points that we're going to focus on more in terms of, what is the floating storage look like? And realistically, what is happening in the US? Where are people working? How is driving going? And what does the COVID cases look like? And how is that adjusting how people are carrying out their life? So let's just really dive right in and look at the crude stock build. So we had a build across the board. You have to look at it again with the SPR. We were at about 3.43 million barrels with a build. You had a small draw from PADDI 2, which is just the Midwest. The bigger focus here is going to be what is the total, which was another build, even though we should be drawing at this point in time in the summer. And at the same time, we had a resurgence of crude oil production. Now, the production reversal is really based on just the Gulf of Mexico coming back online after the hurricane or tropical storm came through. So this is still elevated. We have us at about 10.7 million barrels a day. And we should kind of stay within that 10.7 to 10.8 as those shut-ins come back from both the Bakken and the Permian. And we have a little bit coming back from the Gulf of Mexico, but not much above where we were prior to the hurricane. Another big aspect is going to be Alaska. ConocoPhillips has talked about 100,000 barrels coming back in July, and we have some additional throughput coming back in from OPEC in July, which we'll talk about a little later. So really kind of diving right into the DOE crude, we're right at the all-time highs for this time of year. Again, the pace of builds has really slowed, and that's really just because we are drawing a bit more. We have a little bit more throughput, not much, but it's enough to kind of slow us down a touch in terms of where we sit on an export level. And because the exports have gone up a touch, which has also helped us kind of like level off here, which we'll talk about in a few more minutes. Here you can see that PADDI 3 remains a key focus. PADDI 3, we continue to see builds here. We have new floating storage that has just arrived, which has gone from transit into storage within the Gulf of Mexico that will have to come into PADDI 3. And the reason why we focus on this specific region is, one, it has the most amount of storage available, so it'll attract more. But at the same time, as companies try to identify the best place to put their oil to maximize their realized prices, it still remains the Gulf of Mexico, because you have the most refiners, you have the ability to get into the export market. So this is where we're going to continue to focus, because the other areas obviously are important, remain near highs or near all-time highs. But really PADDI 3 is where we're going to get a lot of those prices that are going to help dictate how much the E&Ps really are able to come back. And when we look at, are they able to come back, we have to look at the specific components of how do they make money? How do refiners make money? What are they actually doing in this market, and what is that demand? So again, imports were down. Last week we talked about how there's those timing delays, and you can see that in PADDI 3. PADDI 3, you had a big step down, and it's really just because we've come back to that average. And that's just, again, we're going to kind of ebb and flow. And this week, or rather last week and this week, we're going to see an additional increase in terms of imports as we get a true up and we have new product reaching our shore. Runs, again, we've talked about 70 to 75% being our range, 74.6%. So we get a slight bump up from last week. And here we kind of think we start to plateau a bit. We thought we were going to get a small drop down, but again, small uptick. We're still within that range where we're going to kind of live within this point. And the reason why I say we're going to live there is because a lot of these refiners have already made the lion's share of their purchases for the summer. So the physical market trades 6, 8, 10 weeks out in advance. So they already know what they've done. They already know what they plan to do. And as the Shell CEO said, refinery runs are horrific, and it's just because margins are catastrophic is the word he used. And you're kind of seeing that play out, which is why you're getting this issue with that demand, because refiners just aren't pulling a lot through. So we're getting some semblance of normalcy in some areas, which we'll talk about later, but you can see the US is going to sit at that kind of 75% as that peak. And it's really driven off of the implied demand. Gasoline continued to get a little bit back, a little bit more normal. We talked about 8.5 being that peak. We hit about 8.6, and we think this is now the kind of the plateau, and we're going to start to normalize here and start to play within a very tight range, which we'll talk about in a little bit in terms of what is going to drive that range. Distillate fuel started to come off a little bit. It's still elevated based on where we were, which is a positive. And jet fuel is starting to see a little bit more demand, but again, that's kind of touch and go, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And now, really digging in to the specifics on floating storage, you can see we're back to we're above the seasonal highs. We're back to where we were at the beginning of April, May, and it's just because we have more crude showing up. So this should be the last kind of surge, because when we look at oil in transit, it's less than where it was before. So we're starting to see kind of this is the last surge. We will still maintain above the 5-year average. But again, we're going to start to normalize a bit as we start to import and we turn this from floating storage into onshore storage. And again, this is looking at the imports. Again, it's going to ebb and flow. We're going to get back to the 5-year average. And it's going to always marry with what refiners are doing. And right now, we think refiners, specifically in the Gulf of Mexico, are kind of at their base. So they're going to have to pull in a little bit more imports. They're going to run a little bit more from storage. But again, that's being overwhelmed by the amount of production within the U.S. and the amount of new boats showing up. So we're never going to really see a meaningful draw in crude over the next several weeks, just based on how the economics are working across the board. And when we look at, refinery utilization rates, it's important to just talk about, where we should be. And where we should be right now on average is about 91%. But where we've averaged over the last couple of years, it's really been 94, 95%. So we're about 20% off of where we normally are. And that's going to remain. You can see we had a little bit of an increase, but this is where we start to kind of normalize and average out, and where we think we're going to maintain at least through July 4th. And with some resurgence of COVID in specific regions, changing patterns of life, that's where we're going to see some of these different components balance out. And when we look at, distillate, we talked about moving closer towards the low end. We're kind of hunkering around that 5-year average, which there's reasons why we're going to stay there for a little bit. We've seen a decent amount of pull through on diesel into the trucking area. Railroads remain problematic as well as shipping, but we're starting to see a little bit more in terms of diesel demand into the trucking world, which will be supportive of the amount of demand within the US. But again, nothing to really get us to that new level where we could really see draws coming down. But again, it's a positive data point. It's something that we're happy to see. It's something that's showing that there's a little bit of a normalization. But again, gasoline is going to continue to be a bigger problem going forward. And when we look at gasoline, this is why we look at it on a 5-year level, and you can see that 8.6 or so. We had a nice increase, and again, we're in summer. This is the normal summer driving season, and this is where we start to see a little bit of a plateau, and we kind of hang out between what we're thinking about 8.2 and about 8.6 million barrels a day of gasoline demand specifically, which again will kind of ebb and flow. And when we look at it from using GasBuddy data, you can see that we're starting to plateau. We're starting to see the gains aren't getting as much on a week over week level. Month over month, they're still getting better. But again, you have to consider that we're in driving season. So that's why we talk about more on a year over year. So we're still down about 18.5% in terms of gasoline demand based on, GasBuddy data. And we're starting to see that really, kind of level off. And you're seeing that in terms of just the day over day, week over week. We're starting to get, the percentage increases are changing only slightly or actually going down a little bit. And that's why we're getting a little bit more confidence that, we are starting to hit that plateau and seeing a down month year over year of about 18 to 20%, we think is going to hold through the rest of this summer driving season. Now that we've looked about the internals in the U.S., let's go abroad and let's look at starting with U.S. exports. So when we look at exports, we have to consider, the different products as well as oil itself. And oil had a nice little increase of about 700,000 barrels a day. Now, this is more than what we were expecting, and there's always timing delays. And at the same time, the U.S. pricing actually became more competitive and was able to push a little bit more crude into the market. Now, this is something that should normalize. We think it comes in at about 2.8 next week or this week, that we'll talk about next week. The bigger issue that we're seeing now is gasoline and distillate, which have started to normalize a bit. We're going to get a little bit of an increase because Brazil has actually brought their refiners down to about 55%. But the problem is right now there's a competition between European flow and U.S. flow into the Americas. And right now, Europe has actually sent an increasing amount of product into Latin America and into the U.S. as well on the East Coast. So there's going to be this competition, which while this will help support the U.S. exports, it's not going to be a huge driver where we're not going to get really back to where we should be. We're just going to kind of hang around the low end of the seasonal average. So when we talk about the seasonal average, you can see that, we talked about last week how we were going to get a drop down in gasoline exports. We think we're going to hover right around this level. It makes a lot of sense just given there is an additional pull into Brazil. There's additional pulls into Mexico now that some of the force majeures, some of the cancellations have ended. So those things will start to normalize, pull a little bit more through. But again, we're going to kind of hang below that normal five-year average. Distillate, we talked about how we were going to, pull back, and here we have that pullback. We think we're gonna hang closer to the 5-year average than we were initially expecting. We were expecting something a little bit lower towards the low end of that 5-year. And again, it's just there is a little bit more diesel demand. There's a little bit more pull through, and that will help support our distillate exports. We sent a lot into France, and as Europe starts to normalize a bit, you're going to start to see a bit more of our flow going into Europe as some of that Asian import starts to come off a little bit as India starts to restart and China continues to kind of normalize. So we'll have a bit more competition, but we'll have a little bit less competition, which will be supportive of our exports. And now when we look at it from the view of, U.S. overall, and how it works into the global construct, gasoline had a little bit of a draw, not as much as estimates, but again, we had a build in PADD 1, which is the East Coast, and we had an increase in imports. So we had an increase in imports. Some of the other imports that were expected have gotten kicked out into other areas, specifically through the Panama Canal or into the Americas. And you can see the production. Now, the numbers don't match up perfectly. Again, these are all calculations. And the U.S. On the refining level, we're starting to make a little bit more gasoline. We think this is our peak, about 65% will be the number. And you can kind of see how this chart here, which is just the amount of gasoline being created, marries almost perfectly with where the demand is. And that's why we think we're going to start to see that normalization here, because we don't have the export market that's going to demand more. And we don't have additional driving in the U.S. that's going to demand more, which is why we think we're going to have this kind of healthy number of about 65% as we go through the remainder of the summer. And that leads us into distillate, because here distillate, we're maxed out. You can see we're right about where we were in 2010 in August. And this is where we think we're going to kind of hang in, where we're going to have some ebbs and flows. But again, we've kind of normalized, especially as more jet fuel gets preserved and doesn't get pushed into the distillate storage. And when we talk about jet fuel, it's important to see how it's really kind of stabilized. We talked about last week how we're going to have these ebbs and flows, but it's going to get within a tighter range. And I think you're starting to see that here. And this will continue as we go through a typical vacation season with very historical things happening in terms of COVID and the way people are moving around the world, as well as around the US, which we'll dive into a little bit more on a global level in a few minutes. And that's why we look at the TSA passengers. We're still kind of hunkering around this, let's call it 500 to 650. The spike in cases may adjust this a little bit, but again, we're getting some competitive moves, both for demand, less demand. So that's why we think we're going to kind of hang within this tight range. We're obviously going to remain about 2 million people a day off normal, but we think this 500 to maybe a peak of 800 makes a lot of sense through the summer, which is why we're going to get more jet fuel preserved. It's not going to be dumped into the distillate stream. It may see some go into the gasoline stream a bit because you can create a healthy octane. And when I say octane, when you're at the pump and you see 87, 89, 91, 93, that is the octane rating. That's how much oxygenate is actually in your gasoline. And so it's expensive to make that. And so if you can make it cheaper, you're going to have a little bit of a premium, which refiners are dying for right now. So that's where you could see some of this jet fuel dump into. But this is where we're going to continue to focus on. And if we see any kind of spike, it would obviously be beneficial, but we just don't think we're going to get that surprise. And when we say we don't think we're going to get it, here is just the global look of departures. So obviously China had a big decline on average, and that's really just because of Beijing. Beijing, they shut down the city, they cut about 2,100 flights. And you can see how we're seeing a positive increase of a week over week, which is supportive of jet fuel demand, but we're still far off of historics in terms of if we go back to the December average, but then if we normalize it on a year over year level, we're just going to maintain about 80% below normal when we consider year over year. So the other important aspect is to consider floating storage of refined product. We always talk so much about floating storage of oil. It's important to appreciate that we have a glut of product in the market as well. Gasoline, the changes based on Vortexa, right now the changes, we had about 27 million barrels on floating storage of gasoline. We're down to about 22. Diesel, we had about 23. We're only down to about 22.6. So you can see that the diesel remains the big crux of the problem, which is also indicative of the global economy. The one benefit that we have seen is jet fuel. Jet fuel went from about 13.5 to 8 million. Which is good because it just means that we're seeing some of that come off the water. We're seeing some of the flow normalize, and you're seeing that reflected in the data where we are getting a bit more departures, which is a positive in terms of kind of getting a little bit more normal. But again, we're still 80% below where we were last year. So normal is a relative term in a COVID world. And that's why, when we're looking at COVID, we have to consider where we're looking at on the employee total working hours. Now, HOMEBASE is a company that is used by about 100,000 companies within the U.S. To monitor, which is about several million employees. So you get a sense of kind of where things sit. And this first chart is looking at HOMEBASE hours worked by hourly employees total for all of the U.S. And you could see we have ebbs and flows. Obviously weekends. You're not going to. Less people work on the weekends versus Monday to Friday. But it's important to see how we didn't get a natural spike back up, and that the pace is starting to slow. And this is because we're starting to see these hourly workers come back for hotels, restaurants. Just in general leisure, areas in terms of, the hourly wages that we've seen in terms of retail, some of the areas that are vacation spots. And now we're going to start to kind of plateau and normalize, and we're going to have some competition to see that pace increase as we see some hours go down actually week over week, just as we get some COVID resurgence. And we just picked Texas just because Texas, you saw the biggest move down. And this is an important component because you're seeing this, we're breaking through the trough. And the question is, are we going to start to balance out? And just given where the numbers are going, it's unlikely. And right now we've seen some businesses starting to shut down, not so much because they have to, but because they're doing it as a precaution, their employees are sick, or there's just some concern. Because the big focus for us when we're looking at this and saying, okay, well, how are people changing their lives? If you wanted to go to a store, wander around, are you going to do it when the COVID cases are increasing or decreasing? Do I have to go this week, or can I give it a week or two, see things normalize so I can feel comfortable, I can feel better and safer as I go out? And that's why we're looking at things like this, because as COVID cases start to increase, people will pull back a little bit naturally, not being forced to, not because there's mandates, just because is that additional Target trip, the trip to the hotel for an overnight or a weekend trip, is it really necessary this week, or can I give it 2 or 3 weeks to see things normalize and balance out? And that's what we're seeing here, and something that we're going to focus on, just because this is going to be a big driver for gasoline demand and hourly workers as we look at our unemployment data that we'll talk about it on Friday. Now that we've looked at the EIA, we've talked about some key data points across employee hours, departures. We can really jump into global inventories. Now, Fujairah had a slight increase, nothing major, but Japan had a large decline of about 5 million barrels of oil, even though they had about a 1 million barrel increase in distillate. So here you're going to start to balance out. We think you're going to get a increase in total storage, but again, the pace is going to be much slower. And we're going to see some things normalizing on the shipping level, which will kind of help pull through specifically from Fujairah. But these are things that we're always going to continue to focus on and look at, because it's a good kind of bellwether for where we sit in the global environment. And that turns us to Asia. Now, Asian floating storage is just parabolic. And now, given things will start to normalize as India reopens, as China, throughputs start to kind of get to a more comfortable level. But again, this is the surge that we've been talking about. This is why, China and India essentially went out there and swept the market, which is why a lot of the US, or I should say the indexes, were so excited, because they're like, oh, China's buying, and they're not going to keep buying at this pace. It's impossible. And this is how you can kind of see why it's so impossible, just given the amount of floating storage out there. This is something that will start to normalize and come down a bit, and I'll talk about where. But right now, this is just, keep this in mind as we start going through some specific countries in terms of the amount of floating storage within Asia. Right now we have Chinese refiners. So the state-owned overall are about anywhere between 66 and 85%. The idea is to get to an average of 70 to 75% on the state-owned refiners. And now the teapots, or the independents, were at about 75%. They're now closer to about 72, on their way to 65. And it's just given based on what's being dictated by China, or I should say the Chinese government, and just where their product sits. They continue to have a problem internally. Imports being down 16.7% really kind of shows you, look, traffic is down. The way people are spending within China is down, which is going to impact how a lot of this oil, goes into product, and then where does that product go afterwards. And that's why we have to look at just global storage as a whole. And we had an increase across the board on floating storage, back setting new highs. And it's really because things that were in transit are now showing up at the shores. And this is really driven by the US and Asia. So those are the two focuses that we're going to have going forward in terms of how quickly is this floating storage coming down. With some of these refinery runs, specifically in the US and China, remaining relatively flat, this is going to be a very sticky number, and is going to weigh on pricing on both the products, the margins at the refiners, but then as the indexes go kind of on the next few weeks. And when we talk about gas oil prices, gasoline prices, this is what refiners are looking at when they're figuring out, can they make money? What are the crack spreads doing? Gas oil pricing has come back. We can see it had a nice little run. It's just here we start to see where there's going to be pushback. Things are starting to balance on a pricing level which is going to continue to weigh. Now, we talked about shipping, we've talked about rail and trucking, and that's where we're starting to see a little bit of a normalization on the way those are being used. But again, pricing is going to be impactful here. And this is just going to weigh on refiners and is going to hinder their ability to increase going forward. And that's why we look at RBOB and just gasoline overall. Now, obviously, gasoline gets more expensive in the summers. This should continue to move higher. But again, we've now hit the low end of that 5-year average. And this is where we think we're going to sit right now in terms of, we have some nice recovery in demand. But again, we think we're at the very high end of where that demand is going to go. And that's why pricing is going to remain problematic, which is going to weigh on global refiners. Because when we think about gas oil, gasoline, these are all products that can move around the world. And this is going to continue to weigh on refiners because we're just not seeing the pricing respond at the demand level for refined products, which is then going to hurt the future demand for oil as we go through the summer. And that's why when we look at India, so going through the end of May, obviously India imports were down big. This is going to increase in June. And the IOC, or the Indian oil official company for oil, or I should say energy, they're seeing some increase in demand. So right now, gasoline demand is now about 86% of last year. Diesel is about 90% of last year, which is why they're going to get their refiners back to about 90%. But again, it's a kind of a tale of two cities. While the IOC has a reason to get back, they're being mandated. They need this. They need to backfill some of the demand, some of the flow. Other refiners are not seeing the same type of pull through. Now they're coming off of 30%. They're getting back to about 50. But there's going to be this kind of mishmash of what is actually happening. Where are things moving? How are things going? So India imports will increase, but again, we're going to be at the low end of the 5-year average, which is going to keep some of that floating storage very sticky in terms of what is India doing, Korea, China, Japan. We're going to continue to see that floating storage remain elevated. And now when we talk about refiners and we talk about pricing, we have to talk about the official selling prices, and they continue to rise through July. Now, understand that the GCC, or the Gulf Cooperation Council, they cut an additional 1.2 million barrels a day of production that is going to come back in July. So these increases are also, they're accounting for that. Now, the problem is, even though they're accounting for it, they still increase their pricing, which is going to hurt refiners exponentially as they go to buy additional flow for July, August. Now, we talked about how the lion's share has been purchased, but there's still some spot cargoes and resales that have to happen. And the OSPs are a big gauge for that. So the fact that pricing has increased across the board is going to be problematic for all refiners that are looking there and saying, look, guys, like, my demand is terrible. I can increase the prices of my product, and you're just tightening the screws, which is why we think we're kind of here where refinery throughput will be on a global level. And we can't forget Russia, because Russia exports, they cut exports a little bit further for July. They're down about an additional 500,000 metric tons, and some of the numbers say 1.2. Again, some things will get added over time, and we think that you're going to get some additions as they start to kind of feel for where the market is. What does demand look like? They've talked about giving additional to India as they start to normalize. So this is going to be a fluid number. It's something that we're going to watch, just because Russia is obviously a big part of the OPEC plus agreement. And as you start to see 1.2 million barrels a day come back on from the GCC, does Russia start to kind of edge a little bit higher, just given where they might see demand in the near term, where they might capture some market share that they think they might have missed out on? Now, we have to just keep focused on India, China. It's going to continue to be an issue. So the two parties have met. There's some de-escalation happening, but again, there was also de-escalation before there was that conflict, or the skirmish, if you will. And even though they're talking a great game, they're continuing to build assets on both sides. So this is something, again, assets can be put in, they can be pulled out. So we have to consider what is actually being moved. So right now, they're moving machinery. They're moving some artillery. And this is something to watch as the saber rattling continues, as the politicians and the rhetoric starts to soften. You have to look at what's happening on the ground, because this could be another flashpoint, or we think it will be a flashpoint through the end of the year as India and China start to come out of their economic slump. They maybe want to distract their populace from how bad the economy is or COVID. And this is going to be an issue that we're going to continue to look at. This week we have coming up a podcast with Seema Shah of Credit Intel, where we're going to do a deep dive on the retail, the consumer, and what happens next. And then Friday we have our favorite topic, the primary vision frac spread count, and some economic data that we think is going to be relevant in terms of where things go from here. So thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Thanks again.